Parshas Korach, I wanted to talk about not the beginning of Parshas Korach, but really the end of Korach, which is the end of Parshas Korach, which is a discussion of Aaron and his staff. In that context, before we get into Aaron and his staff, I want to point out a connection, even though it's a tangential connection, between our daily Talmud study and also the parsha. So the daily Talmud study tonight's Daf Yomi is Avodah Zarah, page Chet, Avodah Zarah 8. And the Daf Yomi tells us the following, that there is this holiday called Kalenda. I'm reading to you from the text. There's a holiday called Kalenda. Yes, it sounds like calendar. That took place 8 days after the winter solstice. Meaning there was a winter solstice, and after that there was 8 days that the pagans made a holiday, and then there was another holiday called Satarnura, like Saturn, that was 8 days before the winter solstice. And now the Talmud says something which is going to connect to our portion. It says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, V'fi shera'a Adam Harishon. Adam, the first Adam, saw that basically when Adam was observing the year, and it started coming to the winter, and he saw that there was a big problem, that the Yom Shemit Ma'et V'holech, the days were getting shorter and shorter, because that's what happens. So Adam says, Oily, Shema Bishvil Shesarachti. Maybe I caused the world to be destroyed because I ate from the tree of knowledge. Olam Chashuch Badi. He says, maybe the whole world is becoming dark on my account. Now you might think Adam's a little bit of a narcissist here because he thinks the whole world depends on him. But I guess if you're the only human being in existence, you could be excused for thinking that the whole world rests on you. So Adam was saying, maybe it's my fault that the world is getting darker and darker. You've never seen this before. So what did he do? So he said, maybe the world is going to be going back to like its primordial state. And this is the death that is decreed upon me from heaven, that the whole world will be destroyed because God said you are earth and you'll return to earth. So Amad v'yashav shmoni hamim betanis. Adam stood up and sat 8 days in fasting, ubetfila, and prayer. And Adam was worried the world was going to be destroyed. Kevan Shara'ah, once Adam saw at the end of these days, Tkufat Teves, he saw that the day was the shortest. V'ra Yom Shemarich V'olech, and then he saw that the next day got to be a little bit longer. Amar Minhagos Shel Olam. He says, okay, this is the normal way of the world. Adam didn't realize that. He didn't realize that the world was getting shorter in the winter, and then it starts to get longer. So he says, obviously, it's not a sign that the world is going to be destroyed. And then Adam made the next 8 days following the solstice, he made them days of festivities, days of holidays. L'shana acheres, the next year, when it came again time, that same period, he made the days before and the days after the solstice to be days of festivity. And then at the conclusion of this, he took these days and he established them for the sake of heaven. And they established them for idolatry. And that's basically the story of an 8-day holiday in the middle of the year, in the middle of the winter. And Adam, according to the Talmud logic, this 8-day holiday goes back to the time of Adam. It wasn't something that was just invented in the Second Temple. It was the most ancient holiday. The most ancient holiday was an 8-day winter holiday in the winter when the days were getting darker, and then they suddenly started to get lighter again. And Adam was grateful, and he set up this holiday. And we eventually established it for good, but the pagans established it to worship idolatry. And this is telling us that there is this holiday in the middle of the winter, which is established already by Adam. We, of course, have a holiday which we celebrate at that time period, known as Hanukkah. So I want to show how this relates to our portion, and then we'll read this passage. So our portion does anybody want to take a guess how this relates to our portion? It's very hard. Unless you have seen the source, I doubt you'll be able to get it, but you never know. Does anybody know? Can anybody figure out how this relates to our portion? Okay, so you're leaving it for me. That's fine. Let me just hold on one second. Okay, so it says, and I'll read this with everybody afterwards, but let me just give you the background. The background is that if you go to chapter 17, verse 16, chapter 17, verse 16 tells us that after the rebellion of Korach was put down, and after Korach followers were swallowed up, and the people died in the plague, and Aaron stopped the plague, still at that point it wasn't enough. They still needed to realize that Aaron was better than everybody, that Aaron was better, because they weren't. What was Korach's rebellion ultimately about? I can share this with you. And I saw, I don't know if he's on today, but I got a beautiful message from Bernard Freeman after the last shiur. But according to the rabbis, it seems to be that Korach's rebellion was primarily a rebellion against Aaron. That they were rejecting Aaron as the Kohen. They were saying he's not worthy to be the Kohen. Or really not that he's not worthy, but all of us should be the Kohanim. Why should one person be considered to be more capable, more spiritually talented, or have a spiritual vehicle more than everybody else? And why should that be genetic? All of us could do it. So they raised this complaint. And so Moshe Rabbeinu, at the direction of God said to Moshe, what you have to do is take a staff from each one of the princes of each of the tribes. And this staff was supposed to be taken, and all the staffs were left out overnight in the Ol Moed. And on each staff, you write the name of the person who's the prince of that tribe. And on the name of the staff from the tribe of Levi, you write the name of Aaron. And you shall place it in the Ol Moed and leave it there overnight. And the Torah says to place Aaron's staff in the middle of all the other staffs. Came the morning, and Aaron's staff had budded, blossomed, and in fact, the Torah says it began to grow almonds. It seems kind of random. Why almonds? And then the verse tells us that Aaron's staff was supposed to be a mishmeret. It was supposed to be kept as a watch. So the Gemara in Horios tells us that when the ark was lost, that's when we lost Aaron's staff. During the end of the first temple period, the ark was lost. The ark was hidden away by the Jews at the end of the first temple. And at that period, they also hid the jar of man and the staff of Aaron. So this staff of Aaron remained in the ark or right next to the ark until the end of the first temple. I think it was Yoshia who hid it away. I mean, I could hold on 1 second. I can't let this go. It's actually a Talmudic source from our next tractate, which is Horios. That's the next tractate we're going to do. Hold on 1 second. Let me just bring it out. Hold on 1 second. Okay, I have it right here. Horios is the shortest of all the tractates. I think it's the shortest, but it's definitely by far from the easiest. It's not the easiest at all. Anyway, the Talmud tells us in Horios, let me just cite this text. It says as follows. It says as follows. Okay. It says in the top line of Horios 12a, it says that when the ark was buried, hidden away, also the anointing oil, the jar of man, and the staff of Aaron was hidden away together with its shkedeha upracheha, with all of its almonds and its flowers. Meaning to say, this ark of Aaron remained alive. The staff of Aaron remained alive, even though it was removed and it was kept. It was like one of those forever flowers that you can buy, that lasts for a really long time. Well, the ultimate forever flower was Aaron's staff, and Hashem commanded that they were supposed to take this staff and place it in the Ol Moed, and this would be a permanent sign that nobody should make a complaint against Aaron. And Moshe did this, and the next day we had these almonds, and so therefore it was kept there, and it was only removed once the ark was removed. But until that time, nothing happened to it. So, okay, so back to the text of the. I just checked out that source. So now back to the text. So why almonds specifically? So about this, I wanted to share what the Baal HaTurim said. The Baal HaTurim says as follows. The Baal HaTurim says, why almonds? He says, chapter 17, verse 23, he says that, why does it say Perach vayotze Perach vayotze tzitz vayigmor shekedim? First of all, the reason why it mentions these three items of growth on the staff, that it began to blossom, it grew a flower, then it budded, and then it developed the almonds. The reason is because there were three individuals who ultimately challenged the concept of the kahuna. Who were these three individuals? They were Korach, Yeravam, and Uziyahu. Korach is in this week's portion. He challenges it. Yeravam is the reference to Yeravam ben Nevat, who was the most wicked of all the kings. He was the first king of the 10 tribes that seceded from the Davidic dynasty. And he also tried to usurp the priesthood. He usurped the kingdom by taking it away from the house of David. And he also tried to usurp the priesthood. As it says in 1 Kings chapter 13, the man of God came to Beit El from Judah while Yeravam was standing atop the altar to burn the incense. So Yeravam thought he could be a Kohen. And the last one who tried to do it was Uziel ben Amaziah. Uziel ben Amaziah was the 11th king of the Davidic dynasty, and he also tried to bring the sacrifices himself. And why? So why did it grow specifically shkedim, almonds? So the Baal HaTurim tells us that the numerical value of the word shkedim is Chashmonaim. And now we get to the 8-day holiday with the Hasmoneans, because the Hasmoneans are from the descendants from Aaron, and in their hand the priesthood endured. So all of a sudden we see something very powerful, that really what was the holiday of Hanukkah about? According to the Baal HaTurim, he's saying that it was really an attack on the Kohanim. The holiday of Hanukkah was a revolution of the Kohanim. It was a revolution of the Kohanim. Matasyahu led it, Mila Hashem Elai, and they restored the temple. So it was an attack upon the Kohanim and this concept of the Kahuna. And so that's what's hinted to in the almonds, according to the Baal HaTurim, and it's the same numerical value as the Hashmonaim. Now, whether or not the text had that in mind is almost secondary to the idea that the Baal HaTurim wants us to note. And the Baal HaTurim says the shkedim is a symbol, became a symbol of the fact that it became a symbol of the fact that an attack upon the kahuna was something that God completely rejected. And this is something that I feel really gives us a prism into how we approach our faith. Do we accept there's this concept of a Kohen who is endowed with more sanctity, who has certain levels of laws that responsibility, and we're obligated to honor them? Or do we reject it and say, we don't understand this concept anymore? Why is it relevant to us? Why is this person considered to be on a higher spiritual level just because he's a Kohen? He's born that way. That's not something that's consistent with American values, that somebody could just be born one way and thereby endowed with the right to give a specific blessing. But that's the concept of the kahuna. That's what the Chashmonaim were about. Korach was against it. The Chashmonaim stood up for that. Ironically, they then sinned because they tried to reject that very concept by trying to say we should be kings also. And in doing that, they were rejecting this whole concept of Hashem tells us what our place is in society. It doesn't mean you can't achieve greatness, it doesn't mean you can't achieve greatness if you're not a Kohen. It just means that you're given a specific role. The Talmud tells us, we saw this also in our tractate on the Daf Yomi, that a person who's a Noahide, he's not even Jewish, can achieve a level of holiness even greater than the Kohen Gadol. This is what it says in the text of the Talmud that we saw earlier this week. Maybe we saw it. Hold on, let me share it with you. It says here, in 3a, it says, Minayin shafilu ovi kochavim. Even if he's an idolater, and he engages in Torah study, he is going to be the equivalent of the Kohen Gadol. It doesn't mean an idolater. It means a person who's not of the Jewish faith, and he engages in Torah studies to the full extent of the law of his ability, that he is going to be the equivalent of the Kohen Gadol. And so the equivalent of the high priest. So in some ways, the Torah is completely a meritocracy. Anybody who uses their talents to achieve spiritual goals and to study Torah and to come close to God is even greater than the high priest and the Kohen Gadol. But on the other hand, the Torah also tells us there are certain roles and avenues and responsibilities that a person has based upon who they are, whether they're a man or whether they're a woman, how they're born, and that's from God, and that we're not supposed to mess around with. And so it's not a complete meritocracy, but it's also not a complete caste society. It's this combination, and we have to recognize that the Torah is telling us that's the path, that's the Torah path. Person might want to reject that, but anyway, that is the Torah path. Anyway, let me just pause there for a moment, see if anybody has any questions about this idea, and then I'll share some of the Hasidic comments on it. Okay, so I want to clarify that the reason why this relates to Korach is because the rabbinic understanding of the Korach dispute is that the main complaint of Korach was that he was passed over for the kahuna, said he should be the Kohen. And the Baal HaTurim says this, and Rashi says this, and other commentaries say it. So I'll first share with you the source from the Baal HaTurim, and then I'll share with you the source from Rashi. The Baal HaTurim says that Moshe says on the Pasuk, chapter 16, verse 30, V'imbriya yivra Hashem, if God will create a new creation, upatzta adama es pia, and will open up its mouth, ubala usam, and swallow them up, that's kol asher lahem, and everything that belongs to them, v'yardu chayim she'ola, they'll go down alive to their death, v'datem ki nil'atzu an Hashem ha'elas Hashem. Then you'll know that these people have provoked Hashem. It has to be done. Their death had to be done in this supernatural manner to indicate that God is the one who's giving the direction. And the Baal HaTurim says, Ki ni'atzu an Hashem ha'elah is, if you take the initial letters, Rashi Tevot HaKohen, Al Shebikshu HaKohuna, it says, if you take the first letters of Ki, Hanashim, and Niatzu, you spell Kohen. And this tells us that, or HaKohen, it spells the Kohen. This tells us that the ultimate reason for their provocation was they sought the kahuna. They sought the kahuna. That's what it was about. They wanted to be the Kohen. Each wanted to be the Kohen. That was their goal. That was the center of this dispute, the central argument. And that's why the response has to come from Aaron. Aaron is the one who runs into the crowd to stop the plague with the incense. And Rashi points this out also at the very beginning. Rashi says, it says in the Rashi, well, Rashi says at the beginning, he says Mara Korach achok Moshe. What did Korach see to argue with Moshe? He saw that he was passed over for being the Nasi. But other sources say that it was because he was jealous that Moshe made his brother the kahuna. He says, Rav lachem, you've taken too much for yourself. So where does he say that? Rashi says, you took too much for yourself. And Rashi says, why are you exalting yourself? If you've taken for yourself the kingship, meaning Moshe was the king, you should not have appointed your brother as the Kohen. He's very upset about that. He's very upset that his brother was appointed to be the Kohen. And so therefore, Korach's driven by this total rejection of the concept of the kahuna, which is really the idea that in our faith, that there's a Kohen. He has the Torah tells us that when a Kohen gives a blessing, he's channeling the bracha of God through the Kohen's blessing. We do it every day in our yeshiva. This morning we have 3 Kohanim giving us brachos. So that's what Korach was fundamentally upset about. So hopefully, and that's the relationship to this portion. The rabbis see it as that's the main argument of Korach. It's not 100% clear from the text, the literal text, that that's the main argument, but the rabbis view that as the main argument. Okay, let me pause to take the question of, we're going to share a couple of ideas about Aaron's staff gathering and growing into the almonds. I'm very taken by this idea of the almonds. So let me just share a couple of ideas about this. This is an idea from Rav Kook's father. whose name was Rav Shlomo Zalman HaKohen Cook. Rav Cook is Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook. He moved to Israel, and if I'm not mistaken, his father was in Lithuania. With that, I read Rav Cook's biography. I think it might have been Lithuania, but let me just, it can't hurt to look this up. Let me just, want to get this right. Um, a, hold on. Okay, he was born in, okay, let's see. He was born in Geriva, which is the Cortland Governorate of the Russian Empire. His father was a student of the Volozhin Yeshiva, the mother of Lithuanian yeshivas. So his father studied. I don't know exactly where the full biography now, but yes, his father studied in Lithuania, and and he was traveling. I guess his father also moved to Israel. His father was traveling as a emissary from the land of Israel, yes, to collect money for the yeshivos. So he came to one of the communities and he found a giant dispute, a huge machlokas between the worshipers and the gabbai in the synagogue. Okay, when it happened then, it happens now. Not surprised that there was a dispute in the synagogue. It seems to be a common theme amongst the Jewish people. So when Rav Shlomo Zalman HaKohen Cook came there, and he was a Talmud Chacham, a great Torah scholar, and he was a messenger from the Holy Land. They received him with a tremendous greeting, and they honored him greatly. And they requested from him that he should be the angel of peace to bring peace to the community. So Rav Shlomo Zalman HaKohen Cook, he went up and he began to give a drasha, and he began to give a Dvar Torah to the community. And when he started to speak, he mentioned this dispute of Korach with his followers, and he asked them, why specifically, the question that we're wondering about, why specifically did Aharon's staff grow almonds? Why, and not another fruit? Why didn't it grow a tomato? Why didn't it grow an apple, or I don't know, a pear? Why did it specifically grow almonds? So this was his answer. He says it's to tell us what is the result of a dispute. What's the result when we have fighting? Because when there are, with respect to almonds, there are two types of almonds. This is what he said, and his world was the world of Torah. So in the world of Torah, if you look at the tractate Maasros, tithing, in the first chapter, it says there are two types of almonds: sweet and bitter and sweet. So one type is the type that's sweet, starts off sweet, but in the end it's bitter. But the almond that starts off bitter ends up being sweet. Okay, so this is the introduction. He says there's two types of almonds. One's a sweet almond, one's a bitter almond. The sweet almond starts off bitter but ends off sweet, but the bitter almond starts off sweet and ends off bitter. And he says, so too, as it relates to fighting and peace. He says, when you have a fight at the beginning, the fight is, like everybody gets all worked up. They're all like, they're in a frenzy. They're all excited. It feels like sweet. You get like this enormous passionate hatred. But in the end, you're just bitter. You just realize how empty it is and how bitter everything is and how bitter, what a complete and total waste of time it was. But peace is the opposite. Peace is at this outset it's bitter. At the outset it's bitter because it's so hard to walk away from a fight. It's so hard to walk away from a fight, and the Yetzer Hara is burning inside us and doesn't let us walk away. It's telling us, it's trying to encourage us to get involved and make it, and and do all sorts of things, and coming up with brilliant ideas. But in the end, if a person does not fall into the trap of the Yetzer Hara to continue the fight, but instead humbles himself for the sake of peace, how sweet it will be for all the sides. And this is what he did. He got up and he said this, and everybody said, okay, let's make peace. So, let me just, in case people missed the story, I'll just say it again so people got the whole thing, so you chop it. Rav Aharon Yitzchak HaKohen Cook's father, he used to travel around, and he came. His name was Rabbi Shlomo Zalman HaKohen Cook. He came to a town, and he found them fighting. They asked him to give a drasha. He said, why specifically was it almonds? And he said, it's because the almond has two types of almonds. There's one bitter and then sweet, and there's one that's sweet and that's bitter. And both of them they start off the opposite way. The one that's ultimately sweet starts off bitter. The one that's ultimately bitter starts off sweet. He says, when we fight, we don't have the perspective of how it's going to end. Because at the fight, if we start off fighting, it often feels good at the beginning, but at the end, it's terrible. And if at the beginning we're able to refrain from fighting, it feels very bad, but in the end, it's tremendously sweet. Remember that, because it's a very, very true statement, a very true statement. When we fight, we ultimately lose. Even if we win the fight, we always lose. Okay, so we're time for maybe one or two more. So what is the Rebbe Rabuna Mipeshischa? What does he say? He says something about why. It says Aaron's staff blossomed, and it came out to be a flower, and it budded, and then it grew an almond. So he says, just like all of Israel, so too every Israel has a portion. One person gets the flowers, one gets the buds, but the fruits, that comes from the tzaddik. So he's saying basically, the Rebbe Rabbunim says, attach ourselves to a tzaddik so we can get the highest level of a good. I'll just do one more. This is from Rav Itzela Volozhin. Rav Itzela Volozhin says the following. On the pasuk it says, Moshe said to all of Israel, everybody gather their princes. One from each prince should be one prince from each tribe. Each one should take a staff, 12 staffs, and Aaron's staff will be amongst them. And Rashi says on this that you have to put Aaron's staff in the middle. Aaron's staff was in the middle because it was going to be a test. They're going to be left out all night. And Aaron's staff was going to be in the middle, so they can't complain. They can't claim it was a magic trick. And Aaron's staff grew because it was closest to the Shekhinah. But Rav Itzela Volozhin asked the question, if that's correct, it should have said in the pasuk, Rashi should have written this on the next verse where it says he placed the staff. They placed Aaron's staff because they placed it in the middle, but he shouldn't have said when he said take the staffs. But Rashi gives this comment on the verse which says take the staffs, not on placing the staffs. So Rav Itzela Volozhin explains that the Nesiim, the princes, were concerned that maybe Moshe had some expertise into which tree would blossom quickest, even though it looks dry. And so therefore, he was going to pick that staff for Aaron. Therefore, he said, also when we take them, I want to make sure that there's no question. And so therefore he was very careful to be to say, I'm not, there's no magic tricks here. I mean, Rashi was concerned that obviously people are going to accuse this of being a cheap magic trick. And so therefore he had to go out of the way to indicate that. Anyway, this is just some of the ideas about Aaron's staff and about the rebellion against Aaron that I want to share with you today. Hope you'll remember this fundamental idea that I know I'm going to try to remember is that why specifically was it an almond? Because the almond teaches us about the power of peace and when we argue and not to get carried away, but to look at the big picture. Also, just say that an almond is the quickest fruit to ripen. And when it comes to fighting, it's often the things that we do the quickest that has the biggest mistakes. So bear that in mind as well. All right, we'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address.